Ilara became a widow in the last breath of autumn, when the larches on the high ridges had surrendered their final gold and stood like skeletons against a sky the color of old pewter. She was 19. The word itself, widow, felt like a stone in her mouth, a heavy, ill-fitting thing she could neither swallow nor spit out. Liam, her husband of a single year, had been a man made of laughter and sawdust, strong in the way of the pines he felled. A falling tree, a moment of cruel miscalculation in the woods, had taken him, leaving behind only a deafening silence and a half-finished cabin on a plot of land that was itself an act of stubborn, foolish hope. The land was theirs, but it was a miserable inheritance. It was a sliver of forgotten earth tucked into a sharp bend of the Serpent River, a place the valley elders dismissed with a flick of the wrist. It was too close to the water for the spring melt, they said, and too exposed to the northern winds that scoured the valley from solstice to equinox. The cabin was Liam's folly. He had built it with his own hands, felling the timber and setting the stones for a hearth that smoked more than it warmed. The walls were thin, the gaps between the logs chinked with moss and mud that crumbled with every gust of wind. It was a house that argued with the weather and always lost. Worst of all was the floor. It was nothing more than the earth itself, packed down and cold, a constant seeping dampness that seemed to steal the warmth from the very marrow of her bones. In the days following Liam's burial, as the community's initial flurry of sympathy cooled into pitying glances and hushed commiserations, the cold of that floor became her most intimate companion. It was a physical manifestation of her grief, a chill that started in her feet and crept upward until it settled around her heart. She had nothing else. Liam's wages had been spent on tools and nails and the small precious panes of glass for 2 windows that now seemed only to frame the encroaching bleakness of the coming winter. Her own family was a generation gone, lost to the fevers that had swept through the valley years before. She was an island, a solitary figure in a landscape that prized community and convention above all else. The town council, a body of grim-faced men led by the formidable Master Thorn, summoned her a week after the funeral. Their meeting room was paneled in dark, polished wood that smelled of beeswax and certainty. Master Thorn, a man whose face seemed carved from the same unforgiving granite as the mountains, looked at her not with malice, but with a weary impatience, as if she were a problem to be solved and filed away. He cleared his throat, a sound like gravel shifting. "The deed to the land, such as it was, is in your name now, Ilara. A poor charity, I know." Liam was a good lad, but his head was full of dreams, not sense. "That plot will be under water come April, and a block of ice come January." He leaned forward, his hands steepled on the heavy oak table. "My advice as head of this council, and as a man who knew your father, is to sell it. Silas the blacksmith might give you a few coins for the timber, enough to see you through to spring. You can find a position, perhaps in my own household. My wife needs help in the kitchens. It is honest work. It is a sensible path." Ilara sat perfectly still, her hands clasped in her lap to stop their trembling. The offer was not unkind, but it was a cage. To become a servant, to live on the scraps of another's life, to abandon the one thing that was hers and Liam's. It felt like a second death. She looked at the faces of the other men around the table. They were mirrors of Thorn's expression, a blend of pity and practicality. They saw a girl, fragile and lost, in need of guidance. They did not see the core of iron that grief was slowly, painfully forging within her. She found her voice, a small, thin thing in the heavy silence of the room. "I thank you for your counsel, Master Thorn, but I will remain in my home." A murmur went through the room. Thorn's eyebrows, thick and gray, drew together into a single, formidable line. "Home. Child, that is not a home. It is a shelter, and a poor one at that. The ground itself will heave you out before the snows are deep. Do not let sentiment cloud your judgment. Survival is a practical matter, not a poetic one. But her decision was made. It was not a decision born of hope, for she had little of that left. It was born of something harder, something more elemental. It was a refusal to be erased. She walked out of that council room with the deed clutched in her hand, the thin parchment a flimsy shield against the weight of their disapproval. The whispers followed her down the muddy track that served as the town's main street. Grief has unsettled her mind, proud and foolish. She'll come begging before the first frost. The cabin, when she returned to it, seemed to have absorbed the town's judgment. It looked smaller, more pathetic. The wind whistled a mournful tune through the chinking, and the dirt floor felt colder than ever. She sank onto the rough-hewn stool by the hearth, the fire nothing but a bed of sullen gray ashes. For hours she sat there, watching the light fail, feeling the despair wash over her in cold waves. She was 19 years old, and her life was a ruin. The world had become a place of sharp edges and biting cold. She thought of her grandmother, a woman who had seemed to possess a secret, quiet language with the world, a woman who saw patterns where others saw only chaos. The earth has a long memory for heat and cold, her grandmother used to say, her voice a low, rhythmic hum as she worked her garden. It remembers the sun and the frost. You just have to know how to ask it to remember the right one. The words were a ghost in the room, a faint echo from a warmer time. The next day, driven by a need to do something, anything, other than sit and drown in the silence, Alara walked down to the riverbank. The Serpent River was low, its voice a sullen murmur as it slid over the rocks. The water was clear and painfully cold, the current pulling at the smooth, dark stones that lined its bed. She sat on a fallen log, pulling her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. The sun was a pale, distant disk in the sky, offering little more than light. Its warmth was a memory, a promise for another season. She trailed her fingers in the water until they were numb, then pulled them out, cradling them in her lap. Instinctively, she reached down and laid her frozen hands on a large, flat stone at her feet, a dark piece of basalt that had been in the sun's weak path all morning. She expected nothing, but the stone gave back a surprising, gentle warmth. It was not hot, but it held a deep, resonant heat, a stark contrast to the biting air. It was a living warmth, a stored energy. She pressed her cheek against it, closing her eyes. The stone felt solid, ancient, and deeply comforting. She stayed there for a long time, simply feeling that slow, steady release of captured sunlight. She thought of Liam's folly, of its cold, damp floor that was the source of all the cabin's misery. The house was a sieve, leaking warmth at every seam, but the greatest leak was the ground itself, a vast, frozen anchor that leached the heat from every log she burned. As the afternoon bled into a bruised purple twilight, the air grew colder still. A frost began to silver the edges of the dead leaves, yet when she touched the stone again, it was still discernibly warm. It was giving back the day's meager sun, slowly, patiently. It was remembering the heat. Her grandmother's words returned to her, no longer a ghostly echo, but a sudden, brilliant flash of insight. The earth has a long memory. You just have to know how to ask it to remember the right one. A plan, audacious and utterly mad, began to form in her mind. It was a plan born of desperation and observation, a whisper of inherited wisdom colliding with the hard reality of her predicament. If the dirt floor was the problem, she would remove it. If the cold earth was her enemy, she would replace it with an earth that knew how to remember the heat. She would fill her house with the river. The work began the next morning. It was a task of monumental, backbreaking foolishness. Her only tools were a spade with a splintered handle, and a rickety wheelbarrow Liam had cobbled together from scrap wood. She started in one corner of the single-room cabin, driving the spade into the packed earth. The ground was hard, resistant, laced with roots and small stones. Each shovelful was a struggle, a grunt of effort that sent a jarring shock up her arms and into her shoulders. She dug, piling the cold, dark soil onto a piece of canvas near the door. The air filled with the scent of damp earth and decay. By midday, her back was a knot of fire, and blisters were already rising on her palms. She had cleared a space barely large enough to stand in, and had a pile of dirt that seemed impossibly large. She looked at the shallow pit she had made, then at the vast, untouched expanse of the rest of the floor. The scale of the task was overwhelming. The whispers of the town seemed to echo in the small space. Madness. Folly. She is digging her own grave. For a moment she faltered. Her body ached, her grief was a raw wound, and the sheer physical reality of her idea was crushing. She was one small, tired person against the unyielding earth. But then she thought of the alternative. The slow, creeping cold. The surrender. The kitchen of Master Thorn. She thought of the gentle, persistent warmth of that river stone. She picked up the spade again. Her movements became a rhythm. Drive the spade, lift, turn, empty. She stopped thinking about the whole floor and focused only on the next shovelful, then the next. It was a meditation of labor. After she had dug down a few inches, she took the wheelbarrow for its first trip to the river. The path was uneven, and the barrow's single wheel wobbled and bucked against the terrain. At the river's edge, she waded into the icy water, her ankles screaming with the cold. She began to choose her stones. They had to be right. Not the sharp, broken shale, but the smooth, dense, dark stones. The ones worn round by centuries in the river's tumble. Basalt and granite. Stones that felt heavy and solid in her hands. Stones that seemed to hold the weight of time within them. She chose them for their size and shape, looking for flat, broad surfaces. Each one she selected was a promise. She loaded the wheelbarrow until she could barely push it. The muscles in her legs and back straining with the effort of hauling the dead weight back up the slight incline to the cabin. Her days fell into this brutal, repetitive pattern. Dig and haul out the earth. Push the empty barrow to the river. Wade into the numbing water. Select the stones. Load the barrow. Strain and struggle to push the load back to the cabin. Unload the stones into a growing pile that began to look like a cairn built by a giant. Then back to the digging. She worked from the first gray light of dawn until her muscles screamed and the twilight made it impossible to see. She ate little, a piece of hard bread and some dried apples, her exhaustion too profound for hunger. The inside of her cabin was transformed into a chaotic construction site, a pit of raw earth and the mountain of smooth gray stones. The town watched. Her isolation was now complete, but it was an isolation punctuated by the stares of passers-by. Children, emboldened by their parents' disdain, would sometimes creep to the edge of her clearing, watch her heaving the stones, and run away whispering, "The mole woman, the mole woman." One afternoon, two of the town women, on their way back from gathering firewood, stopped at the edge of her property. They did not greet her. They just stood and watched, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and condemnation. "It is a sin to disturb the ground of a home like that," one said, her voice carrying on the wind. "She's inviting the cold in, not keeping it out." Silas, the blacksmith, came to visit a fortnight into her labor. He was a broad, kind man, whose face was permanently smudged with soot, and whose hands were calloused into slabs of leather. He had been a friend of her father's and had always had a soft spot for Alara. He arrived carrying a small sack. He stood in the doorway of the cabin, his large frame filling the space, and surveyed the scene of devastation within. His eyes took in the deep, rectangular pit that was now nearly 2 feet deep, the towering piles of earth outside, and the monumental collection of river stones inside. He looked at Alara, at her dirt-streaked face, her raw hands, and the fierce, exhausted set of her jaw. He let out a long, slow breath. "Alara, girl, what in the name of the ancestors are you doing?" His voice was gentle, laced with a deep and genuine concern. "Master Thorn said you were being stubborn, but this is something else." "I'm fixing the floor," she said, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Fixing it?" He stepped carefully into the pit. "You've dug it halfway to the netherworld. You'll never be warm in here now. The cold will come up from this hole and freeze the tears on your cheeks." He opened the sack he was carrying. "My wife sent some bread and a bit of salt pork. You look like you're fading away." She took the sack, her gratitude a painful lump in her throat. "Thank you, Silas." She explained her idea then, her words simple and direct. She told him about the sun-warmed stone, about how long it held the heat, about her grandmother's words. She described her plan to lay a deep bed of the stones, packed tight, to create a floor that would hold the memory of the fire's heat through the night. Silas listened, his brow furrowed in concentration. He picked up one of the river stones, weighing it in his massive hand. He was a man who understood the properties of materials. He knew how iron held heat, how it could be shaped by it, how it cooled slow or fast depending on its mass. He had never thought to apply that knowledge to stone, not in this way. The common wisdom was wood, insulation, deep foundations dug below the frost line. What she described was alien. "I'll be damned," he said, not with conviction, but with a profound sense of wonder at the sheer strangeness of the notion. "I've never heard of such a thing." He looked from the stones to her, and his expression shifted from pity to a reluctant respect. "It's mad work, girl. The hardest way imaginable. But you're doing it." He didn't offer to help. It was her folly, her burden to bear. But before he left, he took her spade and her wheelbarrow to his smithy. He returned them the next day. The spade had a new, sturdy ash handle, and its edge was honed to a razor sharpness. The wheel of the barrow had been fitted with an iron band, and its axle greased. It no longer wobbled. "A good tool makes any foolish work easier," he said, a small smile touching his lips. It was not belief, not yet, but it was the first crack in the wall of her isolation. The digging was the first agony. The second was the laying of the stones. When she had excavated the entire floor of the cabin to a depth of nearly 3 feet, she began the slow, meticulous process of building her new earth. She started with a layer of the smallest stones and coarse sand, tamping it down until it was firm, a base to prevent the larger stones from shifting. Then came the main course, the large, flat-bottomed stones she had so carefully selected. This was puzzle work, a slow, heavy game of fitting pieces together. Each stone had to be lifted, carried, and settled into place, nestled tightly against its neighbors. She worked from the outside in, her world shrinking as the stone floor grew. She filled every tiny gap with sand and then a thick slurry of river clay, ensuring the entire mass was as dense and solid as possible. It was a floor of solid rock, a single unified slab of thermal potential. The work was all-consuming. Autumn withered and died. The first hard frosts came, rimming the world in white. The air grew sharp, a blade in the lungs. Her deadline was the snow, the true, deep snow that would make her trips to the river impossible. As she worked, Master Thorn paid her one final visit. He did not come alone, but brought 2 other councilmen with him, as if to bear witness to her lunacy. He stood where Silas had stood, in the doorway, his face a mask of grim disapproval. The stone floor was nearly complete, a vast gray mosaic that drank the light. "So this is your grand solution," he said, his voice dripping with scorn. "You have filled your house with rocks. You have made a cave for yourself. I have seen Badger sets with more sense to their design." He gestured at the floor. "And you believe this quarry floor will keep you warm?" "Stone is cold, girl. It is the coldest thing there is. It is what we build tombs from. It holds the heat," she said quietly, not looking at him, her attention focused on fitting a particularly difficult stone into place. Thorn laughed, a short, barking sound devoid of humor. "It holds the cold, you mean? It will suck every bit of warmth from that pathetic fire of yours and leave you frozen by midnight. I came here today to make my final offer. Abandon this madness. Take the pittance Silas will give you for the wood and accept a place in my home. Do it now before the snows trap you here to die. It is my duty as a leader in this community to prevent you from harming yourself." Her back ached. Her hands were bleeding in 3 places. She was tired beyond the telling of it. But a cold, quiet anger rose in her. She finally looked up, meeting his gaze directly. "I appreciate your concern for my welfare, Master Thorn. But my husband built this house, and I will live in it. I will not be a burden on you or anyone else." His face hardened. "A burden is what you are, and a fool besides. Very well, we have done our duty. When the winter takes you, let it be known that you were given every chance to choose a wiser path." He turned and left, the other men following in his wake like crows. The encounter left her shaken, but more determined than ever. His certainty was a goad, his mockery a fuel. She would prove them all wrong, or she would die trying. She finished the floor the day the first snowflakes began to drift down from the pewter sky. The last stone was set, the last gap filled with clay. The surface was uneven but solid, a strange and beautiful landscape under her feet. She spent the next 2 days meticulously rechinking the cabin walls with a mixture of clay and dried grass, sealing every crack she could find. She had a modest pile of firewood, enough for a month if she was careful. Her larder was sparse. Some dried beans, a sack of flour, the salt pork from Silas. It would have to be enough. That night she built a fire in the hearth, a larger one than usual. The flames leaped and danced, casting flickering shadows on the stone floor. She sat on her stool, watching, waiting. The air in the cabin slowly began to warm, losing its raw, damp edge. She put her hand to the floor near the hearth. The stones were growing warm to the touch. It was working. The heat was not just rising and escaping through the roof. It was sinking down, being absorbed into the immense dark mass beneath her. She let the fire burn brightly for hours, feeding it steadily. Then, as she prepared for bed, she banked the fire, reducing it to a bed of glowing embers that would last the night. In the old days, with the dirt floor, the cabin would have been icy cold within an hour. But tonight was different. She lay under her thin blankets, and for the first time since Liam's death, she did not feel the cold seeping up from the ground. Instead, a gentle, radiant warmth seemed to rise from the stones, a warmth that felt like a quiet exhalation from the earth itself. It was not a hot, stuffy heat, but a deep, pervasive comfort that soaked into her weary bones. She slept, for the first time in months, a deep and dreamless sleep. The snow fell for a week, a soft, silent siege that buried the world in white. The valley grew quiet, the sounds of life muffled by the deep blanket. For Alara, it was a time of strange peace. Her routine was simple. She would build up the fire in the morning and keep it steady through the day, heating the stones. In the evening she would bank it, and the floor would give back its borrowed warmth all through the long, dark night. The cabin was a sanctuary of warmth in the frozen landscape. The temperature inside never dropped to freezing, even when the wind howled and the frost on the window panes was an inch thick. Her system worked. It worked better than she had ever dared to imagine. Then came the Blue Norther. It was a legend in the valley, a storm out of folklore that was said to arrive once in a man's lifetime, a meteorological fury that could freeze a running stag in its tracks. The signs came first, a sky of unnerving clarity, a sudden unnatural stillness in the air, and then a faint dark line on the northern horizon that grew with terrifying speed. The old-timers saw it and knew. They shouted warnings in the village street. "The Blue Norther is coming!" "Slaughter a calf! Bring the wood inside! It's upon us!" A frantic energy seized the community. People chopped wood with a desperate fury, hauled water, and boarded their windows. The prevailing mood was one of grim, fearful preparation. And through it all, there were the pitying thoughts for the foolish girl in the cabin by the river. The mole woman will be the first to go. That pile of rocks will be her tomb for certain. The storm did not arrive. It struck. It was as if a wall of solid cold had slammed into the valley. The temperature plummeted 30 degrees in an hour. The wind came with it, not a gust or a gale, but a solid, screaming force that tore at roofs and bent ancient pines to the breaking point. Snow began to fall, not in flakes, but in a horizontal, blinding sheet that erased the world. It was a storm that was an active, malevolent entity, a monster of wind and ice. Inside her cabin, Alara fed her fire. She could hear the storm's unholy symphony, the shriek of the wind, the crack of frozen tree limbs, the relentless rattle and strain of her small home. But inside, her strange sanctuary held. The stone floor, having absorbed heat all day, was now a vast, gentle radiator. The air was warm. The drafts were minimal. She sat on her stool, mending a tear in her cloak, the rhythmic pass of the needle a tiny, calm counterpoint to the chaos outside. She was not just surviving. She was comfortable. She felt a profound, quiet sense of vindication that was so deep it was almost peaceful. She had listened to the stone, and it had not lied. For 3 days the Blue Norther raged. In the village it was a desperate battle for survival. Houses that had been considered warm and tight were revealed to be porous, their heat stolen by the ravenous wind. Families huddled together under every blanket they owned, feeding their fireplaces with a prodigal desperation, knowing their woodpiles were dwindling at an alarming rate. The cold was an invasive presence, finding every crack, chilling every surface, turning breath to frost in the air. Master Thorne's large, well-built house was no exception. Despite his massive hearths and a woodpile the size of a small cottage, the cold had laid siege to his home. The tapestries on his walls were stiff with frost, and his family was confined to a single room, wrapped in furs, their faces pinched and blue. Silas the blacksmith fared little better. On the second night of the storm, a great gust of wind tore a section of shingles from his roof. The snow blew into his attic, and the cold, having found an entry, poured down into the house. His stockpile of wood was running low, and the house was becoming dangerously cold. His wife was coughing, a dry, racking sound that frightened him. His thoughts, through his own misery, turned to Alara. He imagined her alone in that flimsy cabin, in her pit of cold stones. The guilt he felt for not having done more to stop her, for not forcing her to abandon her folly, was a bitter taste in his mouth. He imagined finding her in the spring, a frozen statue in her mad creation. The thought was unbearable. Driven by a desperate protective instinct, he decided he had to check on her. It was a fool's errand, a suicidal journey in the heart of the storm, but he had to know. He bundled himself in every layer of clothing he owned, wrapped a scarf around his face until only his eyes were visible, and took up a heavy iron poker for balance. He stepped out of his house and into a world of white, screaming violence. The wind knocked him back a step, stealing his breath. He could see no more than 5 feet in front of him. He fought his way through waist-deep drifts, leaning into the wind, the iron poker his anchor in the maelstrom. The journey to Alara's cabin, normally a 10-minute walk, took him nearly an hour. He was exhausted, half frozen and battered by the time he saw the faint, blurry shape of her small home through the swirling snow. There was no smoke from the chimney, and his heart sank. He had been too late. He stumbled to the door, his clothes caked in ice, and pounded on it with a frozen fist. He shouted her name, his voice snatched away by the wind. He waited for an answer, but heard only the howl of the storm. He pounded again, harder, ready to break the door down. Then he heard the sound of the bar being lifted from inside. The door opened a crack. A wave of gentle, steady warmth washed over his face. It was so unexpected, so impossible, that he staggered back in disbelief. The air that flowed from the cabin was not just not cold, it was warm. It was a soft, enveloping heat, a profound and absolute contradiction to the world he had just fought through. Alara stood there, holding the door, her face calm in the dim light. She was wearing a simple wool dress, no shawl, no extra layers. Behind her, he could see the cabin's interior. It was a haven of tranquility. A small, efficient fire glowed in the hearth, but the true source of the room's comfort was clearly something else. The smooth, dark stones of the floor seemed to radiate a quiet, confident warmth. Silas stared, his mind struggling to reconcile what his senses were telling him. He looked from her calm face to the serene interior, then back out at the raging blizzard. He stepped inside, and the cold dropped away from him like a heavy, sodden cloak. He unwrapped the scarf from his face, his breath no longer fogging in the air. He was standing in the middle of the impossible. He looked down at the floor, at the stones he had dismissed as madness. He could feel their warmth through the soles of his thick boots. He reached down and touched one. It was as warm as a living thing. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with awe, and a humbling, world-altering confusion. How? It was the only word he could manage to push past his lips. She did not offer a long explanation. She did not gloat or say, "I told you so." She simply looked at him with her steady, quiet gaze and gestured with one hand toward the floor. "The stones," she said. "They remember the fire." The deal was done. In that moment, Silas was not just a witness. He was a convert. His skepticism, the town's skepticism, the weight of conventional wisdom, it all crumbled to dust in the face of that simple, undeniable warmth. He had come expecting to find a tomb and had instead found the warmest, safest place in the entire valley. When the blue norther finally broke, it left behind a world transformed and broken. The valley was a landscape of profound silence and deep, pristine snow. But the beauty masked a harsh reality. The storm's toll had been heavy. Several of the older, flimsier homes in the village had been badly damaged. Livestock had frozen in their barns. Two of the oldest residents, their firewood having run out, had succumbed to the cold in their own beds. The story that Silas brought back with him, stumbling into the village square like a prophet returning from the wilderness, spread faster than a grass fire. He told of Alara's cabin, of the impossible warmth of the floor made of river stones. At first, people refused to believe it. It was a fantasy, a fever dream brought on by the cold. But Silas was a man known for his sober practicality. He was not given to flights of fancy. His earnest, awestruck conviction was impossible to dismiss. So they came to see for themselves. They came in small, hesitant groups, trudging through the deep snow to the cabin by the river. They stood in her doorway, just as Silas had, and felt the wave of gentle heat. They saw the simple fire, looked down at the stone floor, and were rendered silent. The mockery and pity that had followed Alara for months evaporated, replaced by a stunned, grudging respect. They had battled the winter and lost. She had made a treaty with it and won. Master Thorn was among the last to visit. He came alone, his pride a visible weight on his shoulders. He stood stiffly at her door, his face grim, and surveyed the warm, peaceful interior. He did not step inside. His gaze fell upon the stone floor, the source of his greatest misjudgment. He, with all his wisdom and authority, had nearly frozen in his grand house. This girl, with her foolish, womanly notions, had slept in warmth and safety. He did not apologize. The words would have choked him. But he asked a question, his voice tight with the effort of humility. "Explain it to me." the principle. Ilara did in the same simple, direct way she had explained it to Silas. She spoke of thermal mass, though she did not use those words. She spoke of storing the day's fire to fight the night's cold. She spoke of working with the nature of the stone rather than against it. He listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When she was finished, he gave a single curt nod. "You have a keen eye," he said. "Your grandmother would be proud." He turned and walked away, a man whose world had been irrevocably shifted on its axis. The shift in the community was seismic. The name they had for her changed. She was no longer the Mole Woman or Ilara's burden. She became Stone Floor Ilara. The following summer, as people began to repair the damage from the storm, 3 families came to her and asked for her guidance. They wanted to build their own stone floors. She oversaw the work, no longer a solitary laborer but a teacher, a respected innovator. The Ilara method, as it came to be known, began to spread through the valley. People learned the art of choosing the right stones, of laying them deep and tight, of creating a reservoir of warmth within their own homes. The houses in the valley changed. They became more resilient, more attuned to the rhythms of the seasons. Decades passed. The valley prospered. Ilara lived a long and peaceful life in her small cabin by the river, a quiet matriarch of unconventional wisdom. She never remarried, her heart holding a quiet, loyal space for the man of laughter and sawdust, who had, in his own way, given her the challenge that defined her life. The cabin became a landmark, a testament to an idea that had once been dismissed as madness. The story of the 19-year-old widow who filled her house with rocks to survive the Blue Norther became a local legend, a tale told to children on cold winter nights to teach them that the most profound wisdom is often found not in the shouting of the crowd, but in the quiet observation of a single, determined mind. The world, in its vast and noisy complexity, often overlooks the simplest truths. It celebrates the grand gesture, the loud pronouncement, the established fact. But there exists another kind of knowledge, a deeper and more patient wisdom that is written not in books, but in the texture of a stone, the angle of the winter sun, the memory of the earth itself. Ilara's story is a testament to the courage it takes to listen to that quieter knowledge, to trust the evidence of one's own senses against the chorus of doubt. It is a reminder that what society discards as worthless, a forgotten plot of land, a foolish idea, a grieving girl, can hold the seed of profound innovation and survival. Her legacy was not merely a method for staying warm. It was a lesson in perception, a quiet but enduring argument that the greatest resources are often hidden in plain sight, waiting only for a pair of eyes willing to see the world differently.